On the 8th of May 1429, the town of Orléans in France erupted in celebration. For 7 long months it had been under siege by the English, but now, after just 4 days of fighting, the town had been liberated, and the people of Orléans knew they had witnessed a miracle. The speed of their liberation was astonishing enough, but what confirmed it as a miracle was the identity of their liberator. She was a peasant girl, and she was just 17. Her name was Joan. She was a truly extraordinary figure, a female warrior in an age that believed women couldn't fight, let alone lead an army.
Take care what you do, for in truth I am sent by God, and you put yourself in great danger.
These are Joan's own words, recorded in a contemporary manuscript. 6 centuries after her death, her words transport us back into her life and times. To understand Joan's story, we need to explore a world where God and the devil are real. Today, we're more aware than we've been, perhaps for centuries, of the power of faith to drive people to do extraordinary things, for good or ill. And in a world where God's will is at work, anything is possible. Over the centuries, Joan has become an icon to almost everyone. To the left and the right, to Catholics and Protestants, traditionalists and feminists. She's captured the imagination of novelists, playwrights, artists and musicians, and her fame has spread all over the world, taking her from France to Hollywood. I've been studying the medieval world for almost 30 years, and I feel pretty confident in saying she's had more pop songs written about her than anyone else from the Middle Ages. But for all the images of Joan that have been created since her death, only one picture of her survives, which was made in her own lifetime. And it's here, a drawing, almost a doodle, in the margin of the records of the Paris Parliament. It shows what a remarkable and troubling figure Joan was. The clerk knew that the army at Orléans had a young woman with them who was carrying a banner and a sword, but he'd never seen her. Either he didn't yet know or couldn't quite believe that Joan actually, shockingly, had short hair and wore male armour. Instead, he's made her look as a woman should, with long hair, modestly wearing a dress. But while there's only this one faint image of Joan, unusually for anyone in the Middle Ages, let alone a low-born woman, a great deal was written about her by her contemporaries. Even more importantly, her own words have reached us through the centuries with an astonishing strength and clarity. And one of the most remarkable and revealing documents of all is the transcript of Joan's trial for heresy in 1431. This is the most detailed record that survives from any medieval trial, and through it we can hear Joan's own voice. Here she describes the first time she heard a message from God when she was just 13 years old.
At first I was very afraid. The voice came at midday in the summertime in my father's garden. The voice came from the right-hand side towards the church, and I seldom hear it without a light. The light comes from the same side as the voice, but all around there is a great light. It seemed to me to be a worthy voice, and I believe it was a voice sent from God. Once I heard the voice 3 times, I knew it was the voice of an angel.
We might ask, was Joan mad or ill? But for the people of the Middle Ages, the issues were entirely different. They knew that angels and demons did communicate with people of completely sound mind. The problem wasn't how to explain Joan hearing voices that weren't there. The problem was how to tell whether the voices came to her from God or the devil. Joan received her first vision when she was living with her family in Domremy, a small village in the east of France. But the France that Joan was born into wasn't nearly as peaceful as it looks now. It was a country torn apart by war. For generations, England and France had been fighting in what we call the 100 Years' War. Land, including the countryside where Joan lived, was fought over by the two sides, and the English even claimed the crown of France. During Joan's childhood, France was very much on the back foot. In 1415, when she was 3, the French suffered a dreadful defeat at the hands of Henry V on the battlefield of Agincourt. The French army vastly outnumbered the English, but as the flower of the French nobility advanced, they were mown down by a barrage of English arrows. History has attributed the English victory at Agincourt to the supremacy of their archers, but at the time, the French saw it differently. For the people who were there, the explanation for this astounding victory was the will of God. Henry claimed that God was on the English side, but the French knew that couldn't be right. So how were they to explain this bloody defeat? Perhaps it was God's punishment for their sins, because France was convulsed in civil war. The old king, Charles VI, was mad and incapable of ruling. 2 factions, known as the Burgundians and the Armagnacs, were fighting for control of his government. In the medieval world, everything came down to God. Whose side was he on? Just 5 years after Agincourt, France was so bitterly divided that the Burgundians were prepared to believe that God did back the English and made an alliance with them. But Joan and her family supported the Armagnacs, led by the French king's son, the Dauphin, and believed God was with them. And so the civil war went on. For 8 years, defeat followed defeat, until the Dauphin and his Armagnac supporters were pushed back, south of the great curve of the River Loire. For Joan, as for the rest of the people of France, the war was a frightening reality. Her home, Domremy, was an Armagnac village surrounded by English and Burgundian territory. At one point, the village was attacked by enemy soldiers, and Joan, her family and friends had to take refuge for a few days in a nearby town. So perhaps it's no surprise that when Joan began to hear voices, they talked about the war. They said she must go to the Dauphin. He would give her an army, and then she must drive the English out of France and lead the Dauphin to his coronation. Joan wasn't unique in claiming to hear heavenly voices. She wasn't the only person in 15th century France who came forward with a message from God. What was remarkable was what Joan's voice was telling her to do: to fight and to lead. This was an impossible proposition. Joan was young, she was poor, and she was female. And to put her mission into action, she had to reach the Dauphin across more than 250 miles of enemy territory. Surely it couldn't be done. At some point during 1428, Joan managed to reach here, the town of Vaucouleurs, a little more than 10 miles north of Domremy, which housed the nearest garrison loyal to the Dauphin. But its captain sent her away with a flea in her ear. The girl was clearly a fantasist. Her family, he said, should take her home and give her a few slaps. But Joan wouldn't give up. Word of her mission began to spread. And when she came back to Vaucouleurs in February 1429, the captain agreed to send her to the Dauphin's court. What had happened to change his mind? The evidence isn't at all clear. When Joan eventually set off from Vaucouleurs, the people here gave her a horse and an outfit of men's clothes to keep her safe on her dangerous journey. Clearly, they believed in her. But that wouldn't be enough to secure access to the Dauphin himself. We can't be sure exactly what happened, but there is one more clue. One of the 6 men who were given the job of escorting Joan was a messenger from the Dauphin's court. It seems that someone there had heard of Joan's claims, and now the Dauphin wanted to hear more. Like all medieval leaders, the Dauphin knew that his authority was bestowed on him by God. He went to Mass twice a day and looked for signs of God's will in the world around him, wherever they came from. The truth is, the Dauphin was also desperate, and it had to be said that by now anything, even the ravings of a peasant girl, was worth a try. As Joan set out on her perilous journey to the Dauphin's court in Chinon, the situation for the Armagnacs was getting worse. For 5 months, the English had been besieging Orléans, a key Armagnac stronghold on the River Loire. If Orléans fell, the Dauphin's lands in the south of the kingdom would lie open to English attack. On the 12th of February 1429, a skirmish between the two sides ended in a massacre. More than 400 of the Dauphin's soldiers died that day. The English casualties numbered just 4. The Dauphin was here in his fortress at Chinon when he heard the terrible news. He redoubled his prayers, but the siege went on. And then, just 11 days after the massacre, a little band of 6 armed men, dusty from the road, arrived here at his great castle of Chinon. With them rode a girl, dressed as a boy, her dark hair cut short. She'd come, she said, with a message from God. Amid the luxury and ceremony of the Armagnac court, this village girl dressed as a boy was an extraordinary sight. And her message was as startling as the girl herself. If the Dauphin would give her an army, she would save his kingdom and bring him his crown. But the Dauphin had a problem. Her words were intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. If the Dauphin put his faith in a false prophet sent by the devil, his kingdom of France would be lost forever. But if he rejected a true prophet, the result would be equally disastrous. Could Joan really have been sent by God? How to tell whether visions came from God or the devil was a hot topic of theological debate. The greatest contemporary French theologian, a man named Jean Gerson, had even written a book on the subject. This is a 15th century copy of Gerson's work De Probatione Spirituum, on the proving of spirits. It's a kind of manual to guide investigators through the process of establishing whether visions might truly have come from God. It offers a helpful Latin checklist which sets out the basics of the examination. Ask who, what, why, to whom, what kind, whence. In other words, ask what the nature of the visions shows about where they might come from, and what the nature of the person having the visions suggests. But they needed a sign, they said, to prove that her voices truly came from heaven. They asked how she would carry out her promise to take the Dauphin to be crowned at the ancient Cathedral of Reims, given that the besieged town of Orléans lay directly in the way. Joan's answer was simple. Joan couldn't write, so she dictated it to a clerk, and its text survives here in the transcript of her trial. Joan's fearlessness is unmistakable. The village girl from Domremy speaks for God, so she has no hesitation in addressing the King of England, le roi d'Angleterre.
Restore to the maid who is sent here by God, the King of Heaven, the keys to the fine towns that you have taken and violated in France. King of England, if you do not do this, I am the military leader, and wherever I find your men in France, I will make them leave, whether they want to or not. And if they do not obey, I will have them killed.
With her challenge dispatched, Joan and her military convoy set off along the River Loire towards Orléans. On the 26th of April, Joan approached the town itself, and for the first time the English army at Orléans set eyes on the teenage girl in armour. To the English, a girl in men's clothes riding among soldiers could only be a whore and a sign of the Dauphin's desperation. But to the people of besieged Orléans, she was a saviour, come to rescue them. The English had too few troops to enforce a total blockade round Orléans, and Joan was able to slip into the town on the eastern side. She was welcomed like an angel from God, one of the townsmen said, and delirious crowds reached out to touch her as she rode through the streets. But while Joan smiled at the hopeful crowds, privately she was incandescent with fury. She wanted to attack the English, but the Dauphin was still so unsure of what form her miracle might take that he'd ordered her soldiers back to their base. So she found herself inside the besieged town, with no army to break the siege as she'd promised. Joan was left kicking her heels, climbing the town walls to shout to the English that they should surrender to God. All she got in return was abuse. Did she really think, they jeered, that they should give themselves up to a woman and her pimps? The Dauphin's captain was in a fix. The people of the town expected Joan to save them, but without an army she could do nothing. So he slipped out of the town and rode to the Dauphin to beg him to send the soldiers back. It took him 4 days, but his argument was irrefutable. How could God send a sign if Joan had no way of putting her mission to the test? By the 4th of May, Joan had her soldiers, and at last the battle for Orléans could begin. Joan led her men from the front, carrying her banner and urging them on. Medieval warfare was brutal and bloody, and for the first time she saw death in battle at first hand. That night her mood was sombre, and the next day she wrote again to the English enemy, demanding their surrender. She attached the letter to an arrow and had it fired into the English camp. When it dropped to the ground, the shouts could be heard in the distance. News from the Armagnac whore! But for all the abuse they hurled her way, after 2 more days of fighting, the English were rattled. And finally, on the 7th of May, their day of reckoning had come. The decisive Battle of Orléans was fought here, where the English held a fortified tower known as the Tourelle. If Joan could take the Tourelle, the English hold on Orléans would be broken. Once again, Joan was up at dawn. She said her prayers and then led her men into battle. English missiles rained down from the ramparts as the Armagnac soldiers hurled themselves into the fight. Hours passed, but still Joan urged them on, until an arrow caught her between the neck and shoulder. As they saw her staggering and bloodied, the Armagnacs faltered. Was this the moment when God would disown the maid? But a flesh wound couldn't stop Joan's mission. She brandished her banner and pressed forward into the ditch at the foot of the tower. As her soldiers followed her into the attack, sudden fear gripped the English. Their captain lost his footing and toppled fully armed into the river. As he drowned, panic spread among his men, and by sundown, Joan had won a famous victory. After 7 months of siege, the Maid had freed Orléans in just 4 days. Who could doubt Joan now? This was proof that God intended her to pursue her mission. And as she and the Dauphin's other captains prepared to drive the English from the valley of the Loire, news of her miracle began to spread. Just 3 days after the battle, an Italian merchant in Bruges wrote to tell his father in Venice what this maiden shepherdess had done. It seems, he said, that she may be another St. Catherine come down to earth. Meanwhile, Joan herself was growing into her new stature. In February, she had been a simple village girl. Now it was June, and a young nobleman who met her was dazzled by her charisma, by the presence of one sent by God. It seemed to me a gift from heaven that she was there, he said, and that I was seeing and hearing her. And Joan's determination to pursue her mission was stronger than ever. Orléans had been her test, and victory her sign. Now came her true purpose, to crown the Dauphin and to drive the English out of France forever. For centuries, French kings had been crowned in the great cathedral at Reims, and Joan was determined to see her Dauphin crowned there too. But Reims lay more than 100 miles northeast of Orléans, in the heart of English and Burgundian France. It had been years since the Dauphin had even thought of riding to war in person. Now, the Maid was going to take him deep into enemy territory. Joan and the Dauphin rode at the head of the biggest army he could muster. And the combination of thousands of soldiers, with Joan's implacable will driving them on, proved irresistible. Joan's momentum was unstoppable. Some towns held out for a few days, others opened their gates straight away. On the 16th of July 1429, just 2.5 weeks after leaving the Loire Valley, Joan, the Dauphin and the Armagnac army arrived in Reims. At last, the Dauphin could be crowned as the most Christian king of France. Here in the cathedral in Reims was kept a flask of holy oil that had been sent from heaven to France's first Christian king almost 1,000 years before. Every French king since then had been anointed with it during the sacred ritual of his coronation. And now the Dauphin would be no exception. A coronation would usually take weeks of preparation, but there was no time to lose. The Dauphin's servants worked through the night, and at 9 the very next morning he entered this sacred space to receive his crown from God. Just 4 months earlier, the Armagnac cause had been at its lowest ebb. Now the Dauphin had been anointed and crowned as King Charles VII of France. And beside him stood Joan the Maid, in her shining armour with her banner in her hand. When the ceremony was over, she knelt at his feet. "Noble king," she said, "God's will is done." It was a triumph, but Joan's mission was far from finished. Joan wanted to drive the English out of France forever. To do this, she needed to unite the country under the newly crowned king, and France was all the certainty of faith and youth. She was still only 17. She saw the world in black and white. If the Duke of Burgundy would not submit to her king, he'd find her ready to fight. The kingdom's capital remained in Burgundian hands. It was time for another miracle. Just as Joan had taken Orléans, now she would take Paris. Reluctantly, Joan's king agreed to give her the chance. But Paris was a very different challenge from Orléans. It was the most heavily fortified city west of Constantinople. This is one of the few remaining sections of the massive walls that surrounded Paris. There were fortified towers and gun placements on top of the walls, which lay behind an immense ditch that encircled the whole city. And it was defended by English soldiers and native Parisians who hated the Armagnac whore every bit as much as the people of Orléans had welcomed her as a delivering angel. But Joan didn't hesitate. As always, her strategy was simple: attack in the name of God. And the day of the assault could only be a good omen. The 8th of September, the holy feast day of the Nativity of the Virgin. As at Orléans, she led the way into the great ditch, brandishing her banner while a storm of arrows and stones rained down from above. After hours of brutal fighting, Joan called urgently to the enemy soldiers on the walls above.
Surrender quickly in the name of Jesus. For if you do not surrender before nightfall, we will come in there by force, whether you like it or not, and you will be put to death without mercy.
"Shall we, you bloody tart?" came the response, and a crossbow bolt ripped through her thigh. Joan staggered and fell. Her standard-bearer took an arrow in the face and died beside her. She didn't stop shouting for her soldiers to continue the attack, even when the trumpets sounded the retreat and she was carried, bleeding, from the field of battle. Joan wanted to continue the fight, to attack the next day, but her king wouldn't allow it. He'd given her just one day to take the great city of Paris. It was an impossible task, but this had been her chance, and she'd failed. She was distraught. How could anyone understand what had happened? Was this a sign that God had abandoned the Armagnac cause? For Joan's king, that was unthinkable. It was far more likely that God had abandoned Joan. Heaven's help had brought triumph at Orléans and Reims. Perhaps now God expected the king to help himself. And if diplomacy was the way forward,
then Joan's determination to fight was fast becoming a liability. By the end of September, a 6-month truce was agreed, a breathing space for the Armagnacs and the Burgundians and their English allies. And Joan had little choice but to limp back to the safety of the Armagnac lands south of the Loire.
After the failure of her attack on Paris, it suddenly becomes hard to trace Joan's movements. We do know that she was sent on some minor skirmishes, but it seems as though the king didn't quite know what to do with her. If Joan were no longer performing miracles, then what place did a woman have in an army? Perhaps he hoped that the maid might choose this moment to retire gracefully from the public stage. But Joan herself had no doubts, whatever anyone else might think. Her mission still stood. And when the truce expired in the spring of 1430, she was ready to fight wherever she had the chance. In May, news reached Joan that the Duke of Burgundy had attacked the Armagnac town of Compiègne, north of the capital. Undeterred by the fact that she no longer had the clear support of her king or a royal army of thousands, Joan believed that God still wanted her to complete her mission. So she rode here to Compiègne with a group of loyal followers. Joan arrived under cover of darkness on the night of the 22nd of May. The next morning she called for her banner and gathered her little band of soldiers to attack the enemy outside the gates. Joan rode out across the bridge and charged at the Burgundians. She drove her men on and on, calling out that God was with them. But another detachment of enemy soldiers closed in behind her and cut her off from the bridge. Surrounded by the enemy, Joan was pulled from her saddle. Now, she was a prisoner. This was not how Joan's mission was supposed to end. And for the Armagnacs, the fault could only lie with Joan herself. Charles was still the true king, anointed by God, but Joan, they said, had become too proud and willful, and so God had allowed her to be taken. Keeping the Armagnac faith meant abandoning Joan to her fate. But what would that fate be? The Burgundians and the English wanted Joan to be discredited for all to see, but deciding what to do with her, who should try her and on what charges, was no simple matter. It took months, and for all that time, Joan was kept in captivity and ignorance. These were Joan's darkest days. She knew that God had sent her to save France from the English and the false French who supported them. But now God had delivered her into the hands of those same enemies. What did it mean? Perhaps God meant her to help herself. During the long months of her captivity, Joan tried and failed to escape. And then, seeing no other way out, she jumped from the window of the tower in which she was locked. She survived the fall, but her injuries took some time to heal, and she was still a prisoner. In December 1430, Joan was taken to Rouen in Normandy, the capital of English France. It would be here that she would be tried and her fate decided. What happened next was carefully written down, and we can follow it all, word for word, through the transcript of her trial. Joan's fame was so great that the eyes of the world were on this case. Joan was put on trial by her enemies, but she wasn't accused of war crimes. This was a show trial about faith, a process designed to get at the truth as her enemies saw it, to demonstrate that God was not on Joan's side. And for us, it's an astonishing source. Through this unique text, we can trace, question by question and answer by answer, the interrogations to which Joan was subjected. It takes us right into the courtroom. Her main interrogator was a man named Pierre Cochon.
He had supported the Burgundian cause since the beginning of the Civil War, and he was a loyal counsellor of the English King of France. But Cauchon was also a bishop. For him, this wasn't just a matter of politics. It was a matter of faith.
Cauchon's faith was as strong as Joan's. He wanted to prove that Joan was a heretic, that she deviated dangerously from church doctrine. And if he could get her to admit her guilt, he might even save her soul from eternal damnation.
On the 21st of February 1431, Cauchon was ready. At 8 that morning, Joan was brought from her cell to face a panel of judges. The might of the church was ranged against her.
Silence fell, and suddenly she was there, a girl dressed as a boy with her hair cut short. 42 men of the church were gathered there with Cauchon to hear her speak. She was the only woman in the room, by far the least educated, and the youngest by years. But she'd got used to all that since leaving Domremy. Joan's judges might be ready, but so was she.
And the words they spoke were all recorded in the trial transcript.
Will you swear an oath, touching the Holy Gospels, to tell the truth about the things we ask you that concern the faith and all other things that you know?
I don't know what you want to question me about. Perhaps you might ask me things I will not tell you.
For both sides, her revelations from God were the heart of the matter. Those, she said, she had only ever told her king, and she wouldn't speak of them now.
Cauchon's first day of questions yielded very little, and the second day started the same way.
I took an oath for you yesterday. That should be enough.
I advise you to swear, for no one who is questioned in a matter of faith, not even a prince, can refuse to take an oath.
You burden me too much.
In the end, she swore a limited oath, and the questions started slowly and carefully, moving backwards and forwards through her story. Often she answered, but sometimes, from one question to the next, she blankly refused.
Was it well done to attack the city of Paris on a holy feast day?
Move on.
But as the judges wove their web of questions around her, gradually, little by little, something began to shift. They wanted to prove that her revelations were false, but Joan, who was back on the battlefield, even if this was a different kind of war, wanted to prove that they were true. So now, despite her protests, she began to talk about her messages from God.
The voice came at midday in the summertime in my father's garden. The voice came from my right-hand side towards the church, and I seldom hear it without a light. The light comes from the same side as the voice, but all around there is a great light. It seems to me to be a worthy voice, and I believe it to be a voice sent from God.
And once she'd begun, the thread was there to be pulled.
Bit by bit, as they asked and asked again, she began to offer up more details of the voice she heard. And on the fourth day of the trial, what she said was extraordinary.
Is the voice that speaks to you the voice of an angel or the voice of a saint? Or does it come directly from God?
It is the voice of St. Margaret and St. Catherine, and their forms are crowned in beautiful crowns, very rich and very precious.
Which was the first voice that came to you when you were 13 or so?
It is St. Michael that came before me, and he wasn't alone, but well attended by the angels from heaven.
Did you see St. Michael and the angels bodily and really?
I saw them with my bodily eyes, just as I see you. And when they left me, I wept, and truly wished they had taken me with them.
This was exactly what Cauchon wanted to hear. The church accepted that angels and demons could be seen by humans, but it was a tricky thing to know which was which. After centuries of debate, the theological principle accepted by the church was that an angel was not a physical being, but a spiritual one. So the more real physical details Joan described, the more like a demon her visions sounded. But Joan stood no chance of understanding this scholarly argument. And as she tried to demonstrate the truth of her visions by adding more and more detail, she damned herself in the eyes of her judges. Cauchon was inching closer to proving that Joan's messages came from the devil, not from God. But he wanted more. It was time for a change of tactics. For a week, Joan was left to wait in her cell, alone with her English guards, her feet chained even when she slept. Then there was a knock at the door. The interrogations would continue, but now the court had come to her. Cauchon had decided that he would deny her a public stage. Now he and a handful of colleagues would crowd her in the confines of her own prison. Here, surely, they would make the pressure tell. Cauchon believed that when Joan first went to her king, she must have given him proof of her heaven-sent mission.
What sign did you give your king when you came to him?
One that is fair and honourable and most believable and good, and the richest that there is in the world.
Does the sign still exist?
It will last for 1,000 years and more. The sign is in my king's treasury.
Is it gold or silver? A precious stone or a crown?
I will not tell you anything more about it. No one can describe a thing as rich as the sign is. And in any case, the sign you need is that God will deliver me from your hands. And it's the most certain one that he can send you.
Joan's words make it heartbreakingly clear that she still believed that help was coming, that God would perform another miracle and save her. But Cauchon knew he was getting closer. He pushed again on his next visit to her cell, and then again the next day. And finally, she offered up her story. She said that when she'd first been at Chinon after Easter in 1429, an angel had come to bring her king a crown of pure gold. The angel had walked up the stairs into the king's chamber with a company of other angels that only Joan could see. Joan had said to the king, "Sire, here is your sign. Take it." And this crown from God meant that the kingdom of France would be restored to him if he would give Joan soldiers and put her to work. For Cauchon, this was a breakthrough. An angel who could physically walk upstairs, speak to the king's court, and hand over a crown? This must be the conjuring of the devil. This, like her descriptions of her saints, was a story Joan had never told before. Why was she telling it now? Alone under interrogation, she needed to vindicate her mission, to give detailed proof of the truth of what she claimed. But for Cauchon, the devil was literally in these details, and it was the details in the end that proved what the bishop already knew, that Joan was guilty of heresy. The punishment for heresy was clear. She would be burned at the stake. But there was a chance that Joan might still live. Cauchon's hardest task lay ahead. If he could persuade Joan to admit her guilt, he would save both her life and her immortal soul. For 2 weeks, Cauchon tried everything to win Joan round. Kind persuasion, reason and argument, and eventually even the threat of torture. Joan was led to a room in the castle where terrible implements were laid out, ready for use. But Joan was unmoved.
In truth, if you were to have me torn limb from limb and my soul separated from my body, I wouldn't tell you anything more. And if I did tell you anything else about it afterwards, I would always say that you made me say it by force.
Cauchon knew that Joan meant what she said. He sent her back to her cell. Time was running out. The church had done its work, but it couldn't take a life. The sentence would be carried out by the English, and they were impatient to get on with it. On the morning of the 24th of May, 1431, Joan was brought from her prison in Rouen Castle to this square in front of the Abbey of Saint-Ouen. Here, in public, she would be sentenced
and then handed over to the English authorities to be burned. Everyone would see the fate of a heretic. The whole of Rouen had turned out to watch as Joan was bound on a tall platform with the executioner's cart standing by. A sermon was preached, and once again Joan was asked if she would submit to Holy Mother Church. Joan had been so sure that God would rescue her, but still help hadn't come. She needed to buy time. But there was no more time. Cauchon began to read the final sentence, and suddenly Joan raised her voice.
I wish to obey the Church and my judges. The Church says my visions are not to be believed, so I will not uphold them. I submit to Holy Mother Church, I submit.
There was uproar. The maid was recanting. Cauchon asked if she was ready to confess her sins, and an official of the court stepped forward with a document acknowledging her heresy and a pen for her to sign it. She made her mark on the paper. It was done. Now Cauchon delivered a different sentence. Joan would live, but she would be kept in prison for the rest of her life, doing penance for the sins she had committed. Joan was bundled back to her cell. Her submission was complete. After more than 2 years of dressing as a man, she took off her male clothes and put on a dress, and she bowed her head so that her short hair could be shaved off. There could be no clearer sign that her mission was over. Cauchon's work was done. The maid's soul was saved, and now her misguided claims could be safely forgotten. That should have been it. But there are more pages still to turn. Here, on the 28th of May, 4 days after the dramatic events at Saint-Ouen, Cauchon was called back to the castle. It says that he found Joan habitu virili, dressed once again as a man, and her state of mind was profoundly disturbed. Here, the bishop questions her again, but all Joan's calmness and confidence are gone. Now her answers are tangled and much harder to follow. Something had happened in those few days. Later, witnesses suggested that once she was dressed in women's clothes, she'd been assaulted or raped in her cell. But what's clear above all is the overwhelming distress she felt at having given up on her truth and denied her voices. And the clerk noted in the margin that what she said next was the responsio mortifera, her fatal reply.
God has sent me word of the great pity of my betrayal. I have damned my soul to save my life. If I had said that God hadn't sent me, then I would be damned, for I was truly sent by God. My voices tell me I have done harm by saying what I did is wrong. Whatever I said and recanted, I did only through the fear of fire.
This time, Cauchon knew there could be no going back. Joan was a relapsed heretic. She would be handed over to the English to be burned. Early in the morning of the 30th of May, Cauchon and some of his fellow clerics visited Joan in her cell for the last time. Her life was now beyond hope, but perhaps there was still a chance that her soul could be saved if she would finally tell the truth. And this record of what Joan said in the last hours of her life is extraordinarily moving. All her certainties are gone. Rescue hasn't come. She knows she'll die. And yet telling the truth means she can't let go of her voices and visions.
Is it true that you heard voices and received apparitions?
Yes. Whether they were good or evil spirits, they appeared to me. I heard the voices most of all when the church bells rang in the morning and the evening.
And the apparitions? The angels?
They came in a great multitude of the tiniest things.
What of the angel who gave the one you call your king a crown?
I was the angel. I promised my king that if he put me to work, I would see him crowned.
Over the centuries, there have been as many ways of reading Joan's trial as there are people to read it. It's even been suggested that this last conversation on the morning of her death was a fabrication made up by Cauchon to undermine her message. But to me, there's a truthfulness to it. Joan's story of an angel bringing her king a golden crown doesn't seem plausible to us, and it didn't to her judges either. But if Joan was the angel, and the crown her promise of a coronation, it makes much more sense as a way for Joan, alone among her enemies, to make her mission real in the world. But Joan's truth and Cauchon's were incompatible, and that's why Joan had to die. Joan was brought here to the marketplace in Rouen, where a pyre had been prepared. A cap was placed on her head, bearing the words, "Relapsed heretic, apostate, idolater." Joan was tied to a stake on a high scaffold so that everyone could see her burn. As the flames took hold, she called the name of Jesus over and over again. Once she was dead and her clothes had burned away, the executioner raked back the fire to show the crowd that she was just a woman. Then he stoked the flames, so there'd be nothing left of her but ashes.
Joan's body was gone, but her story wouldn't die. Her belief in her visions and her extraordinary courage remained an inspiration. By 1456, just 25 years after her death, the political tide had turned. France was reunited under Joan's Armagnac king, and Joan's case was heard in court once again. This time, Joan was found not guilty of heresy. Since then, Joan has become a legend and an icon. In 1920, she was even made a saint. Now, she's almost an empty vessel into which we pour our own preoccupations, whatever they may be.
But if she becomes all things to all people, we risk losing the human being. The girl who burned in this place was a ferocious champion of one side in a bloody civil war. She was able to do what she did, to achieve what should have been impossible for someone of her class and sex, because she and all those around her believed they were fighting a war in which God's will was at work. And perhaps it's there, in the possibilities that faith can create, and in the violence it can bring, that Joan's world and ours don't seem so very far apart.